On the morning of December 29, 1944, in the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest, one American rifleman saw something that nobody else could see. Not the reconnaissance pilots. Not the intelligence officers. Not the hundreds of battle-hardened soldiers scanning the same tree line for days. He saw a tree. A single tree. A tree that shouldn't have existed. And because he saw what wasn't there, 150 men would live to see the new year. This is the story of how a boy who hunted squirrels in the backwoods became the man who could see through walls, read shadows like words on a page, and kill with nothing but iron sights and an instinct sharper than any scope ever ground. This is the story of Daryl Eugene Powers. The cold came first. It always came first in the Ardennes, that December of 1944, seeping through wool and canvas and skin, settling into the marrow of bones like an infection that never quite healed. It was the kind of cold that made men forget what warmth felt like, the kind that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground and made rifle bolts stick when you needed them most. The snow had fallen for days, blanketing the Belgian countryside in a silence so absolute it felt unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Daryl Eugene Powers knew cold. He'd known it since he was 6 years old, trailing behind his father through the oak forests of southern Indiana, his small hands wrapped around a .22 rifle that was almost as tall as he was. He'd known it in the pre-dawn darkness before the squirrels woke, when frost painted the world silver and every sound carried for miles. His father had taught him to be still, to be patient, to watch not just with his eyes but with something deeper, something that lived behind the eyes where thought began. "You don't look for the squirrel," his father had said, breath misting in the autumn air. "You look for what doesn't belong, the shape that's wrong, the shadow that moves when nothing should move." That lesson had saved Powers' life 17 times since Normandy. He'd counted. Now, on this bitter morning 3 days after Christmas, Powers lay in a foxhole 200 yards outside the village of Foy, Belgium. His M1 Garand cradled across his chest like a sleeping child. The foxhole was barely deep enough to matter, scraped from frozen earth that had fought every shovel stroke, and the snow kept trying to fill it in, as if the winter itself was attempting to bury them alive. His hands were so cold they'd stopped hurting hours ago, which he knew was a bad sign, but he couldn't afford to think about that now. Around him, the remnants of his company lay scattered in similar holes, gray shapes against gray snow, anonymous and interchangeable in their misery. The German tree line sat across an open field, perhaps 1,600 meters distant, a dark wall of pine and oak that had been staring at them for 6 days now. 6 days of watching, waiting, dying slowly from cold and fear and the occasional artillery shell that screamed in from somewhere beyond those trees. 6 days of knowing that somewhere in that darkness German soldiers were watching them just as intently, waiting for the moment to strike. The Battle of the Bulge had exploded across this landscape less than 2 weeks ago. Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and reach Antwerp, and now the entire front had become a frozen chess match where every move could be your last. Powers had been watching those trees since December 23rd. Not just glancing at them between duties, not just scanning them during his watch. Watching them. Really watching them. The way he'd watched the oak groves back home. Cataloging every branch, every shadow, every subtle variation in the pattern. It had started unconsciously, a habit born from childhood. But by the second day he'd realized what he was doing and had committed to it fully. He'd count them during his watch, then count them again, memorizing the gaps between trunks, the way the snow gathered on certain branches, the peculiar lean of one pine that had been struck by lightning years before. Other men saw a tree line. Powers saw individuals, each with its own personality, its own place in the geometry of the forest. He'd counted 140 trees. On the morning of December 29th, as weak sunlight began to filter through the overcast sky, turning the world from black to gray, Powers began his daily count. His eyes moved across the distant tree line with the methodical patience of a machinist checking tolerances, which is exactly what he'd been before the war swallowed him. For 2 years he'd worked at the Wilkins machine shop in Bloomington, measuring steel to within thousandths of an inch, reading micrometers and calipers, training his eye to spot imperfections that most men couldn't see even with magnification. That job had sharpened something his childhood had awakened, an almost preternatural sensitivity to pattern, to symmetry, to the subtle wrongness of things. His count reached 87, then 90, then 100. He paused, his breath catching in his throat not from the cold but from something else, something that made his stomach tighten with an instinct older than thought. His eyes tracked back, counted again. 120, 130, 139, 140, 141. For a long moment, Powers didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stared at that tree line, at the place where tree number 141 stood, and felt something ancient and animal wake up in his hindbrain, the same something that had kept his ancestors alive in darker forests than these. There was a tree there now that hadn't been there yesterday, or the day before, or any day since he'd started counting. It was too perfect. That was the thing that screamed wrongness to him. Not that it was there, but how it was there. The spacing was too even, the branches too symmetrical, the way it stood too vertical against the slight slope of the ground. Real trees grew messy, grew toward light, grew around obstacles. They twisted and reached and bent according to wind and weather and the accidents of nature. This tree stood like a blueprint, like something drawn by an engineer who'd learned what trees looked like from photographs but had never actually seen one grow. Powers' hands, numb moments before, suddenly felt every nerve ending come alive. His heart rate, which had slowed to a dull trudge in the cold, began to accelerate. He knew this feeling. He'd felt it in Normandy, crouched behind a stone wall while bullets chipped stone above his head, when he'd seen a shadow that was wrong, a darkness behind a hedge that was too dark, too still, and he'd fired on instinct, 3 shots into nothing visible, and the MG-42 that had been about to open up on his squad had gone silent forever. "I saw where the gun was not supposed to be," he'd told the lieutenant afterward, unable to explain it better than that. The lieutenant had looked at him like he was crazy or lucky, probably both, and then moved on because in war you don't question miracles, you just accept them and keep moving. But this was different. This wasn't combat instinct or battlefield intuition. This was something he could prove, something he could demonstrate if anyone would listen. The problem was making them understand why a tree that looked like every other tree was actually wrong, why symmetry in nature was a warning sign, why his gut was screaming danger when everything looked peaceful and still. He waited until Sergeant Morrison crawled past his position during the morning rotation. A thick-necked career soldier from Pittsburgh who'd been in the army since '41 and had the scars to prove it. Morrison had survived North Africa and Sicily and didn't suffer fools easily, but he also didn't dismiss his men's concerns out of hand, which made him a rarity in the ranks of non-coms who'd seen too much death to care about details. "Sergeant," Powers called softly, his voice barely carrying above the wind. Morrison paused, turned his weathered face toward the foxhole, his eyes red-rimmed from cold and lack of sleep. "What is it, Powers?" "Tree line. 1,600 meters out, maybe a bit less. There's something wrong." Morrison's expression didn't change, but his body language shifted slightly, a subtle tensing that meant he was listening. He'd learned to pay attention when Powers spoke about things he'd seen. The man had an unnatural eye for detail, the kind that got rewarded with battlefield promotions if you lived long enough. "Wrong how?" "There's a tree that wasn't there before. New tree. Too perfect. Too symmetrical." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "New tree. You're telling me the Germans planted a tree?"
"No, Sergeant.
"I'm telling you they built one." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the distant sound of artillery somewhere to the south. Somebody else's war happening just over the horizon. Morrison stared at Powers for a long moment, then slowly raised his binoculars and scanned the tree line. Powers knew he wouldn't see it, not really. You had to know it was wrong before you could see why it was wrong. That was the trick of camouflage. It worked because people expected to see what they'd always seen, and the brain filled in the gaps with assumptions. "Show me," Morrison said finally, lowering the binoculars. Powers pointed, describing the location with the precision of a surveyor. "From the lightning-struck pine, count 17 trees east. Count 9 trees deep. It's standing maybe 2 meters behind the front line, like it's trying to hide in the shadows." Morrison looked again, longer this time. Powers could see him counting, could see the moment when he found the tree in question, could see the moment when understanding began to dawn. Morrison had been a hunter too before the war. Pennsylvania deer country. He knew about patterns, even if he didn't have Powers' almost supernatural sensitivity to them. "Son of a bitch," Morrison whispered. "It does look wrong. Too straight. Too clean." "Artillery can confirm it," Powers said. "One spotting round. If I'm wrong, we waste a shell. If I'm right." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They both knew what it meant if he was right. The Germans had been hammering this position with artillery and occasional probing attacks for days, trying to find the weak points in the American line before launching a major assault. If they'd gone to the trouble of building a fake tree, it wasn't to hide a couple of riflemen. It was to hide something big, something worth the effort of construction and camouflage, something they planned to use very soon. Morrison was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as he thought it through. Artillery support was precious, rationed like food and ammunition, and calling in a strike on what might be nothing could earn him a reprimand or worse. But Powers had been right before, and Morrison had seen too many men die from ignoring the small details, the tiny warnings that separated the living from the dead. "Stay here," Morrison said. "I'm going to talk to the lieutenant." He crawled away through the snow, moving with surprising grace for a man his size, and Powers was left alone with his thoughts and the tree line and the wrongness that gnawed at his gut like hunger. He kept his eyes on that tree, memorizing every detail, knowing that if they didn't act soon, whatever was hiding there would reveal itself on its own terms, and by then it would be too late. Time moved strangely in combat. Minutes could stretch into hours, hours could compress into seconds, and you lost the ability to trust your internal clock when fear kept pumping adrenaline through your system. Powers thought maybe 30 minutes had passed when Morrison returned, but it could have been 5 or it could have been 50. The light hadn't changed much, still that flat gray dawn that made distances impossible to judge. "Lieutenant's calling it in," Morrison said, sliding into the foxhole beside Powers with a grunt. "Battalion wants coordinates. You better be right about this, Powers." "I am." "How do you know?" Powers was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for something that lived deeper than language. "How do you explain that you can feel when a tree is wrong the same way you can feel when someone's watching you from behind? How do you describe the way patterns speak to you, the way your eye catches on imperfections like a fingernail catching on rough wood?" "Squirrel hunting," he said finally. "You ever hunt squirrels, Sergeant?" "Some." "Why?" "Squirrel freeze when it sees you. Flatten itself against a branch, try to become part of the tree. Most people can't spot them even when they're looking right at them. But if you know what to look for, the curve that's too smooth, the shadow that's too round, the tail that looks just a little bit too much like bark, you can see them every time. My daddy taught me to see what doesn't belong. Not what's there, but what shouldn't be there. That tree shouldn't be there." Morrison nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Let's see if battalion agrees with you." The artillery request went up the chain of command with surprising speed, which told Powers that someone higher up was nervous about this position, worried about what the Germans might be planning. At 0847 hours by Morrison's watch, the first ranging shot came screaming over their heads, a 105mm shell that sounded like the world tearing itself apart. It impacted about 50 meters short of the target tree, throwing up a fountain of frozen earth and splintered wood and snow. "Adjust up 50, right 10, Morrison called into the radio, reading corrections from Powers' directions. The second shell hit 20 meters from the tree. Close enough that if there was nothing there, they'd know it. Close enough that if there was something there, the Germans would know they'd been spotted. The third shell hit the tree directly. What happened next would be burned into Powers' memory forever. A moment of terrible clarity that proved him right and made him wish he'd been wrong. The tree didn't just explode. It disintegrated, torn apart by high explosive and whatever was hiding underneath it, and for a brief moment before the smoke and debris obscured everything, Powers saw it clearly. The gun. An 88mm Flak 36, one of the deadliest anti-aircraft guns ever built, equally effective against ground targets, its long barrel pointed directly at their position, its camouflage netting and carefully constructed tree facade torn away like tissue paper. Around it, German soldiers scrambled, some running, some falling as secondary explosions ripped through their position. "Target confirmed," Morrison was shouting into the radio. Fire for effect! Fire for effect! More shells came, a rolling barrage that walked across the German position with methodical precision, each explosion adding to the chaos and carnage. Powers watched through the smoke and fire, watched the 88 cook off its ammunition in a series of spectacular secondary blasts, watched the German position that had taken days to prepare and camouflage being systematically destroyed. He felt no joy in it, no triumph. Just a cold certainty that he'd been right, and a colder knowledge of what would have happened if he'd been wrong, or if he hadn't been watching, or if he'd dismissed his instincts as paranoia. Later, after the barrage had ended and the smoke had cleared and recon teams had gone forward to assess the damage, the full scope of what Powers had spotted became clear. The 88 had been zeroed in on their position, ammunition stacked and ready, crew prepared to fire. According to the intelligence officer who examined the position, the gun would have opened fire at dawn on December 30th, precisely calculated to catch the American lines during morning stand-to when soldiers were most vulnerable. The 88 could fire 15 rounds per minute, and at 1,600 meters, it would have had clear sight lines to most of the American positions around Foy. Conservative estimates suggested it would have killed or wounded upward of 150 men in the first 5 minutes of firing. 150 men who would go home now. 150 men who would see their families again, who would have children and grandchildren, who would live out their lives never knowing that a rifleman from Indiana had counted trees and noticed a pattern that was wrong. Morrison found Powers that evening, brought him a cup of coffee that was more grounds than water but was hot, which made it precious. They sat together in the foxhole as darkness fell, not speaking at first, just sharing the warmth of the coffee and the silence of men who'd seen too much. "How'd you know?" Morrison asked finally. "Really? Not the squirrel hunting story. How'd you really know?" Powers thought about it, cradling the tin cup in his numb hands, watching steam rise into the frozen air. How did he know? How did anyone know anything that lived deeper than thought, that came from some ancient part of the brain that processed pattern and threat before consciousness even registered them? "I worked as a machinist before the war," he said slowly. "Precision work. Measuring things to thousandths of an inch. After a while, your eye just learns to see when something's off, when the measurements don't match, when the symmetry's wrong. That tree was too symmetrical. Trees don't grow symmetrical, Sergeant. They grow messy. They grow real. That tree grew perfect, and perfect is always fake." Morrison was quiet for a while, sipping his coffee, his eyes distant with thoughts Powers couldn't read. Finally, he said, "Battalion's recommending you for the Bronze Star. Maybe more. What you did today, that was something special, Powers. That was something they'll talk about for a long time." Powers shook his head slowly. "I just saw a tree that wasn't there. That's all. Just saw what didn't belong. Most men can't do that. Most men see what they expect to see. You see what's actually there. That's a gift, son. Don't dismiss it." But Powers wasn't thinking about gifts or medals or recognition. He was thinking about the German soldiers he'd watched die in the artillery barrage, men who'd spent days building that position, camouflaging that gun, preparing to do their duty as they understood it. He was thinking about the terrible mathematics of war, where saving 150 lives meant ending 6, where survival was always purchased with someone else's death. He was thinking about his father, teaching him to hunt squirrels in the Indiana woods, never imagining that those lessons would translate into killing men on a frozen battlefield in Belgium. The war continued. It always continued. On January 3, 1945, Powers' company moved forward to clear the village of Foy, part of the larger operation to reclaim ground lost in the German offensive. The fighting was house to house, brutal and close, the kind of combat where you measured distances in feet instead of meters, and death could come from any window, any doorway, any shadow. Powers moved through the ruined streets with his squad, his M1 Garand held ready, his eyes reading the urban landscape the way he'd read the forest. He saw patterns in the destruction, saw which buildings were likely to hold enemy positions, saw which windows offered the best sightlines. His squad mates had learned to trust his instincts, following his lead without question, and they'd taken fewer casualties than most because of it. They were clearing a row of houses near the church when Powers stopped suddenly. His hand coming up in a gesture that meant freeze. Everyone stopped moving. The squad halted immediately, weapons raised, eyes scanning for the threat. They were learning to trust these moments, these sudden intuitions that meant Powers had seen something they hadn't. "What is it?" whispered Miller, a replacement from Ohio who joined them 2 weeks ago and was still learning how to stay alive. Powers didn't answer immediately. He was staring at a building across the street, a 3-story house with most of its roof gone and walls pockmarked with bullet holes. His eyes moved across the facade, reading it like text, looking for the thing that was wrong, the detail that didn't fit. Most of the windows were blown out, empty sockets staring blindly at the street. But one window on the 3rd floor still had glass in it, somehow surviving the artillery and small arms fire that had destroyed everything around it. That was wrong. Not impossible, but unlikely. And in combat, unlikely usually meant dangerous. Powers studied that window for a long moment, watching for movement, for reflection, for anything that would confirm what his instincts were telling him. He saw nothing. The window was dark, empty-looking, just another piece of architecture in a ruined town. But it was wrong, and Powers had learned to trust wrongness more than he trusted his eyes. He raised his rifle slowly, sighting on that window with his iron sights. No scope to help him, just the instinctive understanding of distance and windage that came from years of practice. 60 meters, maybe 70. Wind from the east, light. The glass would deflect his bullet slightly, so he'd have to account for that. Aim a touch left of center. His breathing slowed, became regular, became part of the rhythm of the shot. He wasn't thinking anymore, wasn't calculating. He was just seeing and reacting, letting muscle memory and instinct guide him. He fired once. The crack of the M1 echoed off the ruined buildings, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of breaking glass. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a body pitched forward through the shattered window, falling 3 stories to crumple on the street below. A German sniper, his Kar 98K rifle still clutched in his hands. A scope mounted on top that would have given him clear sight lines down the entire street. "Holy Christ," Miller breathed. "How did you see him?" "I didn't see anything." Powers didn't answer. He was already moving forward, scanning the next building, the next window, the next potential threat. There was no time to explain how he'd known. No words that would make sense. He'd seen a window with glass in it when all the other windows were broken, and that had been enough. Pattern recognition. Anomaly detection. The same instinct that had spotted a tree that was too perfect, now spotting a window that was too intact. The clearing of Foy took 3 more days. Powers killed 4 more German soldiers during that time, each shot a study in precision, each kill the result of seeing what others missed. He never missed. Not once. His squadmates started calling him Eagle Eye, started making jokes about him having X-ray vision, started treating him with the mixture of respect and superstition that soldiers reserve for men who seem to have made a deal with fortune itself. But Powers didn't feel special. He felt tired. Tired of seeing things others couldn't see. Tired of being right about death. Tired of using skills his father had taught him for hunting squirrels to hunt men. He thought about that .22 rifle, thought about those autumn mornings in the Indiana woods, thought about how his father had told him to look for what didn't belong, and he wondered if his father had known what he was really teaching, if he'd understood that the same skills that put food on the table could be weaponized into something darker and more efficient. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Powers was in Austria by then, having fought his way across Germany in the final bloody push toward Berlin. He'd survived Normandy, the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, and the final collapse of the Wehrmacht, and he'd done it by seeing things that weren't supposed to be there and killing them before they could kill him or his squad. He'd been recommended for the Bronze Star twice, the Silver Star once, and had been offered sniper training 3 times, which he'd declined each time. He wasn't a sniper. He was just a rifleman who could see patterns. When he finally made it home to Bloomington in the summer of 1945, his father was waiting at the train station, older and grayer than Powers remembered, but still straight-backed and clear-eyed. They embraced without speaking, holding each other for a long moment while the other returning soldiers streamed past them. And then they walked to the old truck and drove back to the house in silence. It was 3 days before Powers told him about the tree. They were sitting on the porch in the evening watching fireflies dance across the yard, and Powers found himself talking about Belgium, about the cold and the snow and the tree line that had held 140 trees until it held 141. His father listened without interrupting, his face unreadable in the gathering darkness. When Powers finished, his father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I taught you to hunt squirrels. I never meant to teach you to hunt men. I know. But I'm glad you learned. I'm glad you could see what needed to be seen. I'm glad you came home." They sat in silence after that, watching the fireflies, two men who understood that skills were neutral things, tools that could be used for feeding families or fighting wars, and that the difference between them was only context and necessity. Powers had learned to see patterns in the natural world, had sharpened that ability in the precise work of machining, had applied it to the deadly calculus of combat. He'd saved lives by taking lives, had survived by seeing what wasn't supposed to be there. Daryl Eugene Powers lived to be 87 years old. He went back to work as a machinist, married a local girl named Dorothy, raised 3 children, and never fired a rifle at another human being again. He did teach his sons to hunt squirrels in those same Indiana woods, teaching them the same lessons his father had taught him. Watch for what doesn't belong, see the pattern before you see the prey, understand that the world is full of things hiding in plain sight. But he never told them what those skills had meant in Belgium, never explained that counting trees could save lives, never described the feeling of seeing wrongness so clearly it became a physical weight in your chest. The story of the tree that wasn't there became a minor footnote in the history of the Battle of the Bulge, mentioned in a few unit histories and after-action reports. Most people who read about it assumed it was luck or good reconnaissance, the kind of happy accident that sometimes happens in war. They didn't understand that it wasn't an accident at all, that it was the result of a lifetime of training that had nothing to do with military instruction and everything to do with understanding how the natural world worked, how patterns emerged, and how to spot when those patterns were broken by human intervention. There were no perfect trees in nature, Powers had realized. Only in camouflage. Only when men tried to hide what they'd built by making it look like what had grown. And that difference, that subtle wrongness of human-made symmetry imposed on natural chaos, was visible if you knew how to look, if you'd been taught from childhood to see not what was supposed to be there but what actually was there. Years after the war, a historian researching the 101st Airborne Division contacted Powers, wanting to interview him about the incident near Foy. Powers agreed, and they sat in his living room while a tape recorder turned slowly, capturing his words for posterity. The historian asked him how he'd known, really known, that something was wrong with that tree. Powers thought about it for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "When you hunt squirrels, you learn that nature is never perfect. A real tree will have branches that grow wrong, bark that's damaged, a lean from prevailing winds. It'll have character, history written into its shape. That tree didn't have any of that. It looked like what someone who'd never really looked at a tree thought a tree should look like. And that's how I knew. It was too perfect to be real." The historian nodded, made notes, thanked him for his time. But Powers didn't think he really understood. How could he? You had to have spent thousands of hours in the woods, had to have learned to see the world the way prey animals see it, had to have trained your eye to catch the smallest discrepancies between expectation and reality. You had to have stood in a frozen foxhole in Belgium with death waiting across an empty field and trusted your instincts over what your eyes were telling you, trusted pattern recognition over common sense, trusted that the small wrongness you felt was worth acting on even if you couldn't fully articulate why. That was the secret Powers had learned. The brain saw things before the conscious mind understood what it was seeing. Instinct was just accumulated pattern recognition, stored in neural pathways deeper than thought, and if you learned to trust it, if you learned to act on those whispers of wrongness before doubt could talk you out of it, you could do extraordinary things. You could see trees that weren't trees. You could spot snipers in windows. You could look at a shadow and know something was hiding there. You could save 150 lives by counting to 141 and realizing the number was wrong. In the end, that's what war came down to. A million small decisions made by tired, scared men trying to stay alive, trying to keep their friends alive, trying to see the threat before the threat saw them. Most of those decisions were based on training, on doctrine, on following orders. But some of them, the ones that changed outcomes, that altered the course of battles and saved lives, came from something deeper and stranger. From childhood lessons about hunting squirrels, from years of measuring steel to thousandths of an inch, from an almost supernatural sensitivity to pattern and anomaly that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with how one man's mind had learned to process the world. Daryl Eugene Powers died in his sleep on a cold night in January 2016, 71 years after he'd counted trees in Belgium and spotted the one that didn't belong. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service in World War II, his work as a machinist, his surviving family. It didn't mention the tree. It didn't mention the 150 men who lived because he could see what wasn't supposed to be there. It didn't mention that skills learned in the pursuit of squirrels had translated into the calculus of survival, that attention to detail could be the difference between massacre and victory, that sometimes the most important people in a battle are the ones who see small things and trust their instincts enough to act. But that's how history works. The big moments get remembered, the generals and their decisions, the turning points and famous battles. The small moments, the individual observations and split-second choices that actually determine outcomes, those fade into footnotes and after-action reports, credited to luck or accident or divine providence. Nobody remembers the men who counted trees, except the men who lived because of it. Somewhere out there, scattered across America, are the descendants of the soldiers who would have died on December 30th, 1944, if an 88mm Flak 36 had opened fire on their positions at dawn. They don't know they exist because of a man who learned to hunt squirrels as a child and carried those lessons into war. They don't know their grandfather or great-grandfather survived because someone counted trees and noticed when the number changed, when the pattern broke, when something that looked natural was actually an elaborate deception. They don't know, but they're here, living, breathing, having families of their own, carrying forward the genetic and cultural legacy of men who came home from war instead of dying in it. That's the invisible impact of attention, of seeing clearly, of trusting instinct over doubt. That's what it means when one person's childhood skills intersect with the chaos of history and produce an outcome that ripples forward through generations. The lesson, if there is one, isn't about war. It's about seeing. Really seeing. Not what you expect to see, not what you're told to see, but what's actually there. It's about developing skills that seem unrelated to your circumstances and discovering that everything connects, that childhood experiences shape adult capabilities in ways you can't predict, that the habits of attention you develop in one context can save lives in another. It's about understanding that pattern recognition is one of humanity's superpowers, that we're evolved to spot anomalies and discrepancies, and that if we learn to trust those instincts, if we pay attention to the feeling of wrongness that comes when patterns break, we can see things that others miss. Powers understood this, though he never articulated it quite that way. He just knew that his father had taught him to see the world clearly, that his work as a machinist had refined that clarity into precision, and that both of those experiences had given him tools he needed when the world caught fire and demanded that he use every skill he possessed just to survive. He never regretted learning those skills. He only regretted needing them. There's a difference. The tree that wasn't there stood for maybe 3 weeks total, a temporary structure built by German engineers who understood camouflage and ballistics but didn't quite understand trees, didn't quite capture the organic irregularity that makes natural things natural. It was good enough to fool reconnaissance aircraft and intelligence analysts and hundreds of soldiers who looked at it without really seeing it. But it wasn't good enough to fool a man who'd been taught from childhood to spot the tiny discrepancies between reality and appearance. A man whose eye had been trained by squirrels and steel and the accumulated wisdom of paying attention. That's the story. That's the whole thing. One man, one tree, one moment when seeing clearly made all the difference. No dramatic music, no slow-motion heroics, just cold calculation and pattern recognition and the courage to trust his instincts even when he couldn't prove them, even when calling down artillery on a maybe felt like insanity, even when everyone else thought the tree line looked fine. He saw what didn't belong and he acted on it, and because of that, men lived who would have died, and their children were born who wouldn't have been born, and the world moved forward on a trajectory that was different, however slightly, than it would have been if he'd dismissed his instincts and kept his mouth shut. In the end, that's all any of us can do. See clearly, trust ourselves, act on what we know even when we can't fully explain how we know it. Powers did that on a frozen morning in Belgium, and the ripples of that action are still spreading through time. Invisible but real. A testament to the power of attention and the value of skills learned in quiet moments that prove critical in loud ones. The tree that wasn't there is gone now, destroyed by artillery 79 years ago, scattered into splinters and memory and historical record. But the lesson remains. Pay attention to what you see, trust pattern recognition, Understand that your brain often knows things before your consciousness catches up, and when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate why, it probably is wrong, and acting on that feeling might just save lives you'll never meet, might just alter outcomes you'll never know about, might just make the kind of difference that echoes through generations without anyone remembering your name. That's the real story of Daryl Eugene Powers. Not that he was a hero, though he was, but that he saw clearly when clarity mattered most. And in a world that's increasingly full of noise and distraction and things demanding our attention, that might be the most important skill of all. The ability to focus, to observe, to notice when patterns break and anomalies appear, to trust the ancient instincts that kept our ancestors alive and can still keep us alive if we learn to listen to them.